This is Lena Blunt, the education coordinator at Pendle Hill. We'll be beginning in about 5 minutes. So I invite you to do what you need to do to arrive. Maybe that means removing a distraction. Maybe that means getting water. I invite you to do what you need to arrive. Welcome, and we'll get started in about 5 minutes. Thank you. Welcome to friends who are continuing to join us online. We'll get started in a couple moments. We are recording the lecture this evening, but we'll only be recording those who are spotlighted. That said, if you prefer to keep your video off, that is welcome. I'll give it a couple more minutes as we're gathering. Thank you for being with us. Welcome, friends, both online and in person. We'll be getting started in a couple moments. As a reminder, we're recording this evening. We'll get started shortly. Welcome, friends. My name is Lena Blunt. I'm the education coordinator at Pendle Hill. And it is my pleasure to welcome this hybrid first Monday gathering with Lewis Webb Jr. Lewis is joining us in person here at Pendle Hill on the traditional lands of the Lenni Lenape peoples, and in person with our annual young adult program, Continuing Revolution. There are a number of us gathered here in person who've been gathered for several days, exploring experiments in spiritually grounded abolition. So our conversation this evening is in that context, as well as in the context of our Public First Monday series. Our plan for this evening, once I introduce Lewis, is to settle into some contemplative, quiet listening worship together. Out of that quiet, Lewis will share his message. And then we'll have a question and answer period. Because Lewis is joining us as a part of our annual young adult program, we're going to be prioritizing questions from the young adults in the room and the young adults joining us online. And Francis Crimer, who's also joining us online, will help to moderate that question and answer period. So if you are joining us via Zoom, I invite you to consider your questions as we listen to the message tonight, and be prepared to send those questions in the chat to Francis, who will be helping to collate, coordinate questions, synthesize questions, and Francis will be sharing the questions from our many friends online. Thank you for joining in the experiment that is Pendle Hill. Thank you, Lewis, for joining us in the experiment that is Pendle Hill. Lewis Webb Jr. serves as the Healing Justice Program Director in AFSC's New York office and the National Coordinator of AFSC's Healing Justice Network. After graduating from law school, Lewis has dedicated his entire professional career to criminal justice issues. At the American Friends Service Committee, Lewis focuses his work on decreasing New York's prison population by mitigating paths to incarceration and increasing opportunities for release through sentencing and parole reform. He's widely recognized as an expert on the school-to-prison pipeline, barriers to successful reentry, engaging communities of faith, and cultivating young activists. Thank you for being with us, Lewis.
Thank you.
I now invite us all to enter into a moment of worship. And out of that silence, we welcome your message.
when I joined the in-person community Friday, we were all invited to welcome things into the space. And I asked you all to welcome frustration. And it was a very selfish request. It's the result of what I have been experiencing over the last long time. As those around me, colleagues, friends, family, loved ones, have seen a way forward that envisions a world without prisons, police, and any other aspect of the carceral state. But I can't. They've shown me the light. They've shown me the data. They've touched my heart. They've challenged my thoughts. And yet today I sit here with you in that same frustration, trying to figure out why I can't move to that place that so many around me are convinced is the way forward. And in that struggle, I come back to something I guess I learned in high school. Don't think about it a lot, but it's the, I think it's the first law of motion. Maybe we can show that image on the screen. I think there's at least one physicist in the Zoom space, so you'll confirm with me that the first law of motion, according to Newton, is the law of inertia. And I think it says that a body at rest will stay at rest until and if it is exerted upon by a force, an external force, sufficient to move it. That's what I need. I need that external force to move me closer to an abolitionist heart, an abolitionist mindset, an abolitionist activist. And I've wondered, where have those external forces been? I've identified a few, which I'm going to share with you this evening. But as I do, I think more important than what I share is for those of us who are on a path to abolition, but still not quite there yet, I invite you to consider what external forces are moving you in that direction. So I'm going to share three that have really gotten me started on the path. One I shared with those of us who were together on Saturday, and it was the realization that the system that we are all looking at and challenging and calling for the abolition of is a continuation of probably the worst reality in the world, and that is the enslavement of people. When I look at the conditions of incarceration, the circumstances of incarceration, and I put up a mirror between that and the reality of slavery in the United States, the similarities are undeniable. From separating families to denying access to fundamental needs, and all of the other realities that those who are enslaved and those who are incarcerated experience. One external force that has moved me along the path has been that realization that if I were willing to stand up in 1850 and challenge slavery, I need to be equally as willing to stand up today and challenge the carceral state. The second is a very personal external impact. There are two of them. The first one is a conversation I had with my then 16-year-old son, Giovanni. We were living in the Bronx, New York, and we're talking about 2014, 2015. And in New York City during that time, the police were regularly practicing something called stop and frisk. which is a practice of identifying mostly young Black men in community, and without any probable cause or any other justification other than who they were and where they were, the police would stop and question, maybe search, and simply challenge their right to be who and where they were. New York was pushing back against that. Communities across the city were calling for the end to stop and frisk, and I joined that call. But as someone who was older and had not experienced it personally, I knew it was extremely important to talk to the community that was living that truth. And so one evening after leaving work, I sat down with Giovanni, my middle son, and I asked him, have you ever been stopped by the police? And his response to me was, yes, all the time. And immediately there was a lump in my throat, an embarrassment as a parent, a frustration as a Black man. But I held that in and I asked Tim, how does that make you feel? And his response to me was, it's no big deal, that's what they do. What Giovanni said to me without saying it was that he has been conditioned to believe because of how he shows up in the world, he is less worthy. As a parent, as a community member, as a person of faith, that landed heavily. It challenged me to challenge others, to stand up, stand tall, stand strong in the fight to restore a sense of humanity to young Black men in New York City. We have moved away from stop and frisk. I'm afraid that as we travel that journey that is often filled with valleys and mountains, that we are about to go back into the valley of targeting young Black men. But that reality has moved me a bit closer along the path to abolition. The other very personal external impactor on my effort to move was with my oldest son, Sean. Sean was a very good student in middle school and wanted to go to Friends Seminary. Friends Seminary is a Quaker school around the corner from where I work at AFSC. Me and his mom talked about it, gave it some thought until we saw the tuition and realized that that just wasn't going to happen. So Sean ended up going to a public high school in the Bronx where we lived. And he was doing very well. I think he did exceptionally well his first year of high school. And then I think it was October or November of his sophomore year, I got a call from his science teacher. That was his first period class. And she said to me, I'm really concerned about Sean. He, I had him in my class last year and he was doing amazingly well, but all of a sudden he's not showing up in the morning. And when he does show up, he's coming in with, an attitude. And I said, wow, that doesn't sound like Sean. I know that he leaves in the morning because he leaves before I do. And, I'll talk with him. When I hung up the phone, I immediately called Sean's mom, my wife. And she and I have a different approach to responses to complaints about our children. She said, I'm going to light into Sean when I get home. And I asked her, let's talk to him first. All right, let's find out what's going on. And she agreed. So when we got home and Sean came home, we sat him down and we said, we got a call from your science teacher. And we're really concerned, what's going on? And he said, well, I don't know if you guys know, but couple of weeks ago, they installed metal detectors at our school. They installed 3, but currently only 1 is working. And so we all have to stand outside until we get our turn to go through the metal detector. And it's been taking over an hour. And so that often results in me not getting to my first period class. I heard Sean. My wife and I looked at each other. We shared some tears, and we told Sean that we'll take care of it, not knowing how. Throughout that night, we spoke, and I committed to going to work the next day and resigning so that I could use my education and my skill sets to secure employment at a place that would pay me more so that I could get Sean out of that situation. I walked down 16th Street to my office in Manhattan. And in going to my office, I walked past the entrance to Friends Seminary. And as I was walking past the building, I stopped and I watched how the young people were being received. I think they're called headmasters at Friends Seminary, but the headmaster and maybe some other teacher were greeting the students with smiles and handshakes. And yet, less than 24 hours ago, I heard that my son was greeted with a sense of devalue and told that he's a danger. And the only way he can be invited into a public space is to be searched. And so as I turned the corner to go into the AFSC building, I started writing my letter of resignation in my head. Luckily, I got to the office before my executive director did, because I had time to reflect. And in that time, I realized that if I quit and took, maybe a corporate job practicing law in ways that I didn't want, but would get paid well to do, I was helping Sean. But there are a million young men like Sean in New York City's public school system. And all but Sean would still be subjected to that reality. So that moved me. That moved me a lot closer to doing work around school to prison pipeline issues, those issues that send more young Black men to prison than to college. But I still wasn't moved to abolition. And I don't know why. So again, I started thinking about that first law of motion. And what I realized that the forces that are being exerted upon me to move me to abolition aren't enough. Because that force has to be powerful enough to move the weight of uncertainty that I brought to the conversation. And so I started to wonder, why am I afraid? Why am I afraid to envision a world where healing and restoration replace punishment and revenge? I don't know. I know some of the reasons, but I don't know why they are so powerful in my spirit that I can't be where my colleagues and often my friends are. And one of them we spoke about briefly on Saturday. It is that indoctrination that I've been through, that teaching that being Black, being a man, is equivalent to being dangerous in this society. And we need to monitor them. There's a heaviness in me because I fear. I fear for my children's well-being. I fear for my wife's well-being, and I don't want them walking the streets in communities where people who carry guns and commit crimes are not being locked up. I think there's a spirit of vengefulness in my heart. Probably the heaviest of all is fear of the unknown. Can I really envision a world that does not do what I've been taught was necessary? And I haven't been able to create that vision. And that's frustrating. That is super frustrating, both professionally and personally, because I know that every day that I fall short of calling for total abolition, I'm putting Sean, Giovanni, and now my youngest son, Bryce, in danger of police confrontation, in danger of incarceration, in danger of being labeled as less than. But yet I'm still not there. So I continue to think about the law of inertia. And I realized that notwithstanding my own heaviness, and notwithstanding the need to have other external impacts, there's a third factor that I have less control over. And you all correct me if my understanding of physics is not right on point. But that motion that I'm calling for is also affected by friction, right? Yeah. I cannot move unless the platform I'm on is smooth. And that's a factor in the call for abolition that we don't talk about enough, in my opinion. And that is the narrative. The narrative that we all live with has convinced too many of us too often that what we're calling for is not possible. The notion that we cannot open the prison doors. The notion that we cannot resolve conflict in community. The notion that it's us against them. Those are narratives that have, for me personally, and I suspect others, hindered the motion that I am seeking to be on. It hinders my progress towards abolition. And that's frustrating. That is frustrating in so many ways because I see a better way. At AFSC, we call this our North Star. There is something shining over all of us that tells us there is a way to get to a place of healing and restoration, but there's work to be done. I know it's there. I reach for it, but maybe my arms are too short. I had this conversation with a very dear colleague at AFSC a few months ago, and she told me, Louis, the road to abolition is not one that we all just chart for ourselves and get there without obstacles or detours. Don't get frustrated. And I thanked her and I walked away saying, as a white woman, you can live that. I can't. I know day to day what it is like to be in a community where crime is rampant. And young men have been taught from the day they're born, unfortunately, that they need to be monitored, they need to be watched. But I'm trying. And part of my trying is what I do at AFSC. Collectively, about 6 months ago, we finished a document, I don't know if you can show this on the screen, Jen, called Our North Star. And I'd like to just start with that image. Yeah. In talking about our North Star and trying to find a way to visualize it, an amazing artist who we've worked with for many years created the image that I'm hoping you all are able to see on the screen. And while the actual North Star is out of the picture, I think the most important images on that screen are the lights within. All of us, I believe, have that North Star in us, but circumstances within and beyond our control prevent it from illuminating as brightly as it should. I've shared with you some of the reasons I think my internal North Star is not shining as bright as I need it to. And I invite you all to think about your own internal light. Do you have it turned up enough to envision a world without police and prisons? If enough of us can turn that light on and intensify it to the point where it permeates everything around us, then I think we will get there. We're going to need help. We're going to need to hold each other's hands. We're going to need to pick each other up in those moments of doubt. And we're going to have to trust that what we believe spiritually, that there is that of God in all of us, the internal light shines in all of us. We have to take that from talk to action. And so AFSC has invited us to do that with 7 guideposts. And I'm going to invite us all to consider each of these guideposts individually. I know it's a little difficult to see, so I'll talk us through them. But AFSC, my colleagues and I believe that if we are going to get to that place where we can live without the carceral state, the first thing we need to do is we need to embrace healing and accountability. What does that mean? We need to lay down our need to cause harm, because that's all the carceral state does. And it does it in our name. I was remiss in not opening with a acknowledgement of what happened in Philadelphia past weekend. And I want to do that right now, not just because it's important, but because I think it is also relevant to what we're talking about. So I'm going to invite you into a moment of worship just to hold the community of Philadelphia as we continue this conversation. How does the community of Philadelphia and all of the other communities that are experiencing heightened violence over the last few years, how does it heal? How does it envision a notion of accountability without prisons? What do we say to the mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers of those who were killed due to gun violence across this country? I don't know. The easy answer is we will find them, we will arrest them, we will lock them up, and we will throw away the key. But a call to abolition says that's not the best answer. But how do you say that? How do you sit down in communities that are experiencing this reality and talk to them about healing and accountability without punishment? I've tried, um, haven't often succeeded. I remember a conversation I had with a colleague, not in our healing justice program, but in another component of AFSC's work. And I asked him, could you envision a world where there were no prisons? And he said, yeah, for some people. But, Lewis, what, are you serious? What about the worst of the worst? I don't know. Can we talk about abolition but not make it universal? Is there a need to separate some people from community in such a way that prisons have to exist? Therein lies part of my frustration. What does accountability look like without punishment? We do it though, right? We do hold those we love accountable without punishing them. I do. So I guess the real question is not how do we do it, but why don't we do it? Why don't we allow the love we have for each other trump our need for vengeance and retribution? I don't know. But I do believe that if we are going to end up in the place that I think we all want to be, that's something we have to figure out. AFSC also calls for an investment in public health and community needs. We've all heard of the calls to defund the police, right? AFSC has this messaging team that challenged us around reframing the message of defunding the police because it doesn't land well in community. Part of my frustration. We ended up accepting the challenge and asked each of us to think about what would we do if we decrease by 50% the $2.8 billion we spend on policing and law enforcement in this country each year? What would half of that do in community? It would do a lot. It would save so many children. It would feed so many hungry people. It would house so many of those who are unhoused. But instead, because of that narrative, because of that fear mongering, because of that 400-year history, we have become so dependent on policing that we're willing to give $2.8 billion a year to a force that we know causes harm. Therein lies my frustration. AFSC calls us to support community reentry. Up until recently, we had over 2 million people incarcerated in the United States. 97% of them are released. To what? To be told that your criminal history prevents you from getting a job. To be told that your criminal history prevents you from living in certain places. To be told that your criminal history prevents you from reconnecting with your children. To be told that your criminal history prevents you from exercising one of the most fundamental rights in this country, the right to vote. But it goes deeper than that. in the work, there's a phrase, a word called reintegration, which we often ask people to consider beyond reentry. Reentry is, how do I get a place to live? How do I get a job? How do I do the things that are necessary for fundamental survival? But reintegration is about being welcomed back into society. And that's not legislated, right? That's on each of us. How wide are our arms opened to those who return from prison? I was in conversation with a Quaker meeting it was New York. And they have Quaker meeting for worship inside the prison, and they work with a number of incarcerated people. And so I was in conversation with them, and I asked them, how do you support the people coming home? And they said, we help them find jobs, we help them do this, and we help them do that. And I asked them to engage me in a little deeper conversation. What else do you do? Oh, we invite them to meeting. We welcome them. All of them? Well, if they have certain convictions, because we have first day school, we have to be mindful of that. So maybe not all of them, but we think we're pretty open. Therein lies my frustration. How do we truly allow people to reintegrate into society if we're putting up barriers, both legislative and personal? AFSC calls for us to decarcerate. Seems pretty straightforward, right? 2 million people, way too many. Who do we let out? Some of the quote unquote low-hanging fruit in this conversation are, well, yeah, if you've got someone who's in their 80s and they've been incarcerated for 40 years, their likelihood of recidivism is so low. I can do that. We have a lot of women incarcerated, and we know that most of the reasons women are incarcerated is because of their engagement with others and not because of their own desires to commit crime. So maybe we'll look at decreasing the population of those incarcerated as females. You know what? Maybe we need to rethink drug policies and drug laws, because so many people that are incarcerated are really drug addicts and not big time dealers. So maybe we can let some of them out. But we're not going to let out the murderers. We're not going to let out the rapist. We're not going to let out the quote unquote the worst of the worst. Therein lies my frustration. Who am I to measure someone else's worth? Who am I to decide who is worthy of being in community and who is not? It's never been part of my faith teaching. It's never been part of my sense of equality. And yet, I'm not ready to abolish prisons. Therein lies my frustration. End criminalization and surveillance. Talked about that briefly when I lifted up stop and frisk. People are criminalized because of how they dress, where they live, how they worship. How do we stop othering people? Therein lies my frustration. We go to the next one, please. Prison profiteering, I think that phrase needs to be expanded a bit. Mass incarceration is driven by capitalism. It's really that simple. The amount of profiteering that happens on the backs of those we incarcerate is frighteningly astounding. From private prisons that charge states and cities per bed, filled or not, drive mass incarceration. Prison labor drives mass incarceration. I often joke with my family about this a bit. I think a number of years ago, it was revealed that almost every school chair in New York City was made inside a prison. The clothes we wear are often made inside prisons. I think someone Saturday lifted up, during the pandemic, there was a lot of talk in New York about running out of hand sanitizers. And our then governor very proudly went on national television and lifted up that he has commissioned those incarcerated in New York State to make hand sanitizers for those of us who are free. Not for them, because the alcohol content was too high for them to have access to it. But I don't know what those hand sanitizers ended up being sold for, but the amount of profiteering that happens behind prison walls, therein lies my frustration. For many of us, and I'm looking at the last one, for many of us, the murder of George Floyd was this seminal moment. For many others of us, it was just one more. It really was just one more. The reaction in many communities across all demographics in response to that murder was refreshing, but frustrating. It's a daily occurrence in my community. And it's not necessarily actually murdering Black men physically, it's murdering their spirit. It's murdering their sense of humanity that doesn't get caught on camera, that doesn't get talked about, but is as harmful. Therein lies my frustration. So I'm going to continue my journey to abolition. Every day I believe I get closer. I will celebrate in ways that I probably haven't celebrated in years when I get to the point where I can say without hesitation that there is a better way and I want to be part of it. Until then, I will work on those 7 guideposts, both at work and in my personal life. But I can't wait for the day where I can stand up without hesitation and say, yes, it is time for a world without prisons or police. I pray for that day. And I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. Now open it up for questions, both in the room and on Zoom. Let me just ask that we are faithful to pausing between questions so that we can all hear. Welcome any questions.
Thank you, Lena. I've mentioned in the chat for those online that I'll be collecting the questions for online participants and curating them and sharing them. If you have a question in the room, please raise your hand. I wanted to start, we've already gotten a number of wonderful questions, and some of them were answered after they were asked, before being shared, because Louis, you shared so many beautiful questions with us that you, I think, spoke to us from a place of wondering and humility and experimentation that really embodies what we're trying to do here at Pendle Hill, of coming together in spiritual learning community to try to find our way together to a world we've never seen. And so I wanted to start with a question about the spiritual dimension. You mentioned a few times being a person of faith, and I wondered if you could share with us where spirit feels alive in this work.
Thank you for that question. Probably in two very distinct places. One, when I'm by myself and I don't have to pretend. I can really then, find that spirit in me to tell the truth to myself and to challenge myself without shame or fear that I'll be judged. So it's that spiritual relationship that enables me to be alone and question. I think the other place it shows up most vividly is when I'm with young people. This may not be spiritual in a faith sense, but the energy of their spirits, the tough questions that are often only going to come from those who aren't afraid to be judged, that lifts my spirit, that invites me to be vulnerable. And so it's when I'm alone and when I'm with the energy of young people. That's when my spirit is most touched in this work.
Thank you for that grounding. One of the questions that was put into the chat and then which you answered was wondering about individuals who are so dangerous that total abolition of prisons would put all of us in danger. And I think you spoke to that. And then we received another question that I think is the flip side of that question. Can we set up ways to reimagine how we deal with those who we have decided cannot be in community yet? And I'm curious if you have more thoughts about that alternative set of imaginations of how we might deal, what alternatives to prisons there might be.
The immediate answer is yes, we have to. Statistically, we know prisons don't work. They don't achieve the theoretical goals that we're told they're designed to do. So, do we continue to do what we know doesn't work? And if you answer yes to that, then I think we need to spend a few more years together. The alternative is, there are a couple of ways to approach that. You can, or we can, really sit down and try to design mechanisms of accountability that achieve the goal of restoring relationships, protecting people, and all of the other things that I think when we think about the dangerous criminal we have to consider. But I think the real answer for me is before we get to that question. I have a hard time figuring out when the state has stepped in and solved problems for me. And yet, that's the first place we go to in this circumstance. We pass the responsibility of fixing the problem to the state, knowing very well that it's not prepared to do it. So I think the first step in finding the alternative is being willing to step away from what we've become used to. And then realizing that if we don't have the state to rely on to take away the dangerous from among us, what would we do? We'd sit in community and we'd figure it out. But the state is a crutch. It's an easy alternative, we think. It's hard work to sit with that belief that I can work this out with even the worst of the worst. That's the first step in the alternative, the creation of the alternative, is to stop passing the buck and assume the responsibility of living in community with all in community and figuring out how best to do that. So no, I don't have a blueprint for an accountability without prisons, but I have a very clear belief that it's doable and we have to do it. Maybe next week I'll have the plan.
Thank you. Another friend asks, thank you for this powerful and vulnerable sharing about your journey. I would love to know what the connection is between reparations and abolition. And what do you believe is the way forward toward the narrative change that you speak of?
Thank you for that question. I think abolition is a form of reparation. I think we owe abolition to communities. I think we need to let communities know that we acknowledge the harm that the carceral state has caused. And while we can repair individual lives with reparations, until we dismantle the entire system, true reparations could not happen. So I think abolition is the ultimate form of reparation for those who have been impacted by this system of injustice in this country's history. There was a second part to the question, I'm sorry.
It was about the way forward towards the narrative change that you speak of.
Yeah, narrative change is probably the most challenging part of the work of abolition, because you're challenging a narrative that has been around for a long time and continues to be mic'd, right, in ways that alternative narratives could never be. And I think the most effective way to flip that is to be very mindful of who's delivering your message. In the work at AFSC and the work I do in community, there's this notion of allyship, where those who aren't living the reality align themselves, accompany the communities, and support in various ways. One of the most ineffective ways to be an ally is to control the narrative. In community, I call it, get out the way. I think another way to think about how do we change the narrative is to challenge the prevailing one. right? So often things are said, statistics are thrown out, rhetoric is lifted up without challenge. And it takes work. It takes investment and time and research and all those things. But until we can effectively counter the narrative, it will continue to prevail. And so my answer is be mindful of who your messengers are, and do the groundwork before you challenge the narrative so that you can be as compelling as the current narrative is.
I'm wanting to make sure there's space for friends in the room if they have questions. Please don't be shy to raise your hand. And I think for friends online, if you can message me with your question, that will be wonderful. Another question we received, the second point of the North Star document, invest in public health and community needs. We've received a question about that. If we make progress towards investing in public health and community needs, it seems that crime would decrease. In other words, if people's needs are better met, is there less violence and less crime? Is that part of that, the hypothesis of this North Star document?
That is more than an hypothesis. It is a tested fact that the drivers of crime are often the same drivers that keep people as second-class citizens, right? So if we looked at what circumstances we're putting people in that often leads to behavior that we identify as criminal, we'll find that it's inadequate housing, it's poor educational opportunities, it's all the things that cause us to get angry. And anger often results in poor decision making. So, feed me, clothe me, trust me, educate me. I'm less likely to harm you. As I was riding in for this evening, I was listening to, I guess it was a Philadelphia news station, and they were actually talking about an experiment that's happening in a community in New Jersey. I forget the actual name, but it's a very interesting approach to mental health. We all know, or I know, I should say, and I trust that you all know that when police show up to mental health crisis situations, it does nothing but heighten the likelihood that harm will result. And so this community in New Jersey has decided that instead of having uniformed police show up to a mental health crisis situation, they will still have a police officer show up, but he or she will be in a car that is unmarked. They will be not in uniform. Any weapon that they have will be totally concealed. And in the car with them will be a mental health professional. And they've done this experiment, I think, for about a year now in this community. And they were very honest that it has decreased the community conflict with police tremendously. Because when that image shows up and the person in struggle does not see law enforcement, they see someone there to help them. Makes a big difference in how they respond. And, everything that we can do. Some of my colleagues say, no, we can't talk about reforms. We've got to talk abolition. It's got to be about big picture stuff. Yeah, I get that. But I also get that every time we do something that decreases the likelihood that someone will be killed by the police, that's a way forward. And So look for those moments where we can invest in something other than law enforcement to respond to conflict. I think we'll get a lot further than where we are now.
I'm gonna invite Jamila, who's one of our program participants, to ask a question.
Oh, hi everyone. It's not really a question. And sorry, I'm not in the room, but hey everybody in the room. I just want to say hey. I think it's important to also acknowledge that I think we have a lot of allies in the as far as the work for abolition goes. So I think that this conversation, as we're challenging people to really think about the work that's happening in their communities, I think it's also encouraged to challenge folk to think about what they're doing in the movement. So outside of being an ally, which I consider someone who's a supporter of the movement, I'm looking for more folk who are willing to engage in it, who are willing to be co-conspirators or accomplices in the movement, specifically because it's a lot of work. Specifically as a Black woman excuse me, you can't see me, but as a Black woman to say, hey, yes, I want to do abolition work, and honestly, that's not something I want to spend all my time on. And if we realize that people here are wanting to do this work, I'm going to say, yes, go ahead and do it. But do more than just being a support and knowing the lingo and the verbiage around abolition. But what does it look like to actually engage in these efforts every day in your community, in your households, and continuously? So it's not much of a question, but I wanted to add into the conversation while we're challenging folks. So I appreciate the space.
Thank you. I think what was just lifted up is super important. You know, we all get in where we can, but if we're going to get to the point that we're all hoping for, it's a daily grind. And it's not a grind that we leave to others. You know, we show up, we be mindful of how we show up, but I think showing up is super important. And, you know, find your lane and get to work.
I think, oh, Lena, did you
There's
have
a question in the room.
wonderful?
Thank you.
No, thank you.
I've heard Chief Coker of the Lenape Indian Tribe of Delaware say many times that pre-contact there were no prisons or police officers here on this land that we inhabit today. So the story of this land is already there. And the land remembers a time where community healing was the norm. I wonder if AFSC or if any other healing justice initiatives collaborate with the indigenous people of Turtle Island and honor that wisdom that is held here in order to do this work more fully.
I really appreciate that acknowledgement and the question. When I joined AFSC just about 12 years ago, we were much more intentional in learning from and working with indigenous communities. The reasons that we're less present there are many, all frustrating. I often talk to a colleague that we have on the Wabanaki reservation in Maine. And she and I talk about, you know, what we can learn. And the frustration is that the information is there, we're just not taking it. So, yeah, there was a time where this country did not have 2 million people incarcerated in prisons and the level of policing. And there was a time where we had none of it, like you just lifted up. So I don't know, someone asked earlier, what is the answer? What is the alternative? Maybe it's not as far-fetched as we think, but we're just not talking to the right people and asking the right questions. So thank you.
Thank you, friends. I've been getting some questions in the chat for asking if folks can introduce themselves with their name and pronoun when they speak, so that we can take advantage of being able to learn from each other and our own unique experiences. Another question we got in the chat was, can you share about the tension or balance between incremental change and immediate change, which is something we've been exploring a lot over the course of continuing revolution. Abolition feels like a long, transformative journey, and the urgency is also pressing.
I appreciate that question. And I think a year ago, my answer would be very different than the one I'm going to share right now. I have come to realize that when we talk about criminal justice reform, we're talking about a pendulum. And, you know, pendulums swing until they get to a place of rest. I think that abolition is that place of rest, and reform is, you know, the swing. And for years, maybe for the last 5 years, we've been, in my opinion, swinging in the right direction. But now the pendulum is coming back. And while we do have to do all we can to protect those who are living these injustices in the moment, I think if we don't commit to getting that pendulum, what is the part of the pendulum that controls its swing? What is that called? Anyone know? But that's where the work is. It's not at the ball at the bottom. It's whatever that piece in the top of the pendulum that actually controls how far to the left or to the right it swings. That's what abolition is. It's getting at that piece to a place where when the pendulum is at rest, we're all in the right place. Reform, I think, is, you know, it ebbs and flows, and that's frightening, because that just means you're in a perpetual cycle of work. We need the pendulum to rest at a place of real community well-being. And I think that's what abolition is calling us to achieve. It's to get to a place where we can sit together and not be in struggle, trying to combat the moment. So yeah, I get the need to do immediate reform work because people are dying, people are suffering. But if that's all we do, then we'll be doing it forever.
We had another question in the chat going back to this daily grind that you mentioned, and the ways that some of these principles appear in our individual relationships as well. So you had mentioned that we often don't use punishment with those we love, and a friend asked in the chat, wondering about the times that we do use punishment with those we love, and how we might change the ways that we think about accountability with family and friends and others.
I don't know who asked that question, but something tells me you've been in conversations that I have with my wife in ways that I would not want you to be. Wow. We raised 3 kids with very different approaches to responding to behavior. My wife believes punishment is the way to go, and often exercises it and tells me about it later. when we can have that conversation, when the moment is safe, I ask her and anyone else who's willing to talk to me about it, to what end is the punishment seeking? Is it to cause harm so that the person doesn't do what it is we don't want them to do again? Is it to teach a lesson? Is it to release our own frustration? She often responds, it's so that when they're in the street, they don't get killed by the police. Which often shuts me up, right? When I am in conflict with someone I love, my immediate goal is to resolve the conflict, not to perpetuate the harm. And I can only imagine a world where we did that on a wide scale basis. Address the problem, not the doer. Is how I do it with the people I love, and I think we can do that with all of us. But I'll probably go home tonight and find out that my 15-year-old is punished for something he didn't do or did wrong. It's learning, it's changing, it's growing. And we do that at our own pace in our own time. But if we don't get there, then I think we're in a real bad place.
We are really excited to have this be part of our continuing revolution program, a time when we are inviting young adults on campus to be doing that growing, learning work together in community, recognizing that none of us have the answers to this and we're all asking questions. And I really want to encourage any of the participants in that program who want to share reflections or questions to fold in some of the learning of the weekend into this conversation. And I think Mackenzie wanted to share.
Hi, friends. My name is Mackenzie Burton-Rutledge. I use Z, here, or she, her pronouns. Thank you, Lewis. I have more of a comment that inspired by your physics references and Ricardo Levins-Morales's ecosystem references. I wanted to just speak a little bit. I'm a physicist and I teach physics. And one of the things that we do in physics a lot is go to extremes. You know, something is totally frictionless, or, you know, what if we remove everything in the universe except one electron, and that's all we get? And I think that in abolition work, a lot of us have been trained in that sort of physicist-y way of like, let's remove all the context and just be like, there's one horrible person. What do you do with them? But it's funny because when I teach biologists, they often really struggle in my classes. Because in biology, if you remove everything except one cell, the cell dies. Like, it needs things from the outside to exist. If you take away all the context, you're not doing biology. There's living things never exist without context. And so I just sort of wanted to uplift the both and. You know, I think we can do some of these extreme thought experiments. And Lewis, like, every friggin' day you are working towards abolition, like whether or not you are totally clear that in every circumstance you would call yourself an abolitionist, you're doing it anyway, or like you are doing the work of abolition, and that there are so many ways that don't look like the absolute most extreme imaginable position, like you've been speaking about, of, you know, how do you treat the people you're in relationship with. So that's what I just sort of wanted to uplift. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mackenzie. That lands well. Thank you.
Again, friends in the room, please don't feel shy about raising your hand. In the meantime, we have a couple of kind of definitional questions. One, wondering about punishment. What is punishment? Are setting boundaries or allowing consequences punishment? What are we talking about when we're talking about punishment?
Am I allowed to assume those are rhetorical? I guess not. Huh? Wow. When I think of punishment, I think of putting my burdens on someone else. I think it's about transference. And not in a good way, right? It's about taking that which hurt me and giving it to you. And I don't know where that leaves us other than both hurting, right? Yeah, I think punishment is an outlet. It's a short-term feel-good fix, but serves no long-term purpose, in my experience. As I said, you know, I've heard that it's a teaching tool. I've been taught in other ways that lasted a lot longer. Yeah. Accountability is the word, right? It's really about, we understand that when conflict happens and people cause harm, accountability is the best way forward. The challenge is that we've given up accountability for retribution. We've given up accountability for punishment. It does not hold us accountable. There is no healing when the cause of the harm is simply removed. That just doesn't get us to the place where I think I feel better. I don't often share the story of my own brother who spent 22 years in prison because of a murder. I don't know what those 22 years in prison did for him. I don't know what it did for the family of the man he murdered. I do know that 22 years of something else seems like it would have been better. I know there was a question about the boundaries. I'm not quite sure the context, though. Can someone remind me what the context of that part of the question was?
It kind of distinguishing between punishment and setting boundaries.
Okay. When I heard setting boundaries, I immediately went to parent-child relationships. I don't know whose role it is to set boundaries outside of that. Do I have the right to put boundaries around other people? Do I have the skills to do that? Do I have the knowledge? Do I have the desire? Do I want things to separate us? I think there's more healing in building bridges than boundaries. Or I'm wrong. Yeah, that's all I have for that one. It's probably something I should think a little bit more about, but boundaries very rarely seem helpful to me. Maybe next time you invite me, I'll have a different perspective. There was an assumption there, right?
I'm so grateful for that last piece, this sense that we're all learning together, that maybe tomorrow each of us will know a little bit more than we know today, and we'll learn it from talking to each other and sharing these questions with each other. So I hope this is the continuation of a conversation that will go on from here. And I'm going to pass it back to Lena to close us for tonight.
Thank you, Louis.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, everyone in the room, everyone on Zoom, everyone who is willing to experiment beyond our own understanding and in community and learn and struggle and try together. Louis, I wonder if you have closing thoughts for us before we end the evening.
Certainly want to express my appreciation for the opportunity to be in community with you these last few days. I want to acknowledge the experimental component of it. I often am invited into spaces where the answers are already there. We just want to talk about it. And I politely join those conversations, but on the ride home, I giggle and say, what did we accomplish? I think acknowledging that there's still a lack of clarity is, for me, the greatest motivator to work. And so I hope that answers were not what you all were seeking from me this weekend, but truthful uncertainty. And that's what I've been able to give you. And I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, friends, and good night.
Thank you all.